Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you happen to be around the world. As Wim said, we're very happy that we can talk to a whole range outside the EU, which is our normal target audience, and so very much welcome. I'll be talking about the main messages and the motives for carrying out this study, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions on detail or discuss matters after the initial presentation. So first I'd like to explain the sort of trajectory or the history of this particular study. EASAC is quite a small organisation, so we have to be quite selective on the issues we cover, and so we are particularly motivated to contribute to European issues which are high on the legislative or regulatory agenda. And going back to 2018, there was a lot of public interest and public concern over the state of the environment and the role of plastics. We had high-profile television programs like Blue Planet showing the damaging effects in the marine environment, and that motivated quite a lot of interest within the European Union and the launch of a number of legislative issues. So that led us to carry out what we call a detailed study, which includes members of the experts from our various member academy, which Wim mentioned. In this case, we had experts on circular economy, on recycling, on consumer behaviour, on life cycle assessment, and biodegradability, bio-based, coming from about 7 of our member academies. And that produced this lengthy report, as shown in the screen, Packaging Plastics in the Circular Economy, which was 70 pages and over 300 references. So this was quite a detailed and authoritative analysis of all the issues which the regulators needed to address. Now, since then, we have actually seen quite a lot of progress, particularly in Europe. The Commission and the Parliament have agreed on a single-use plastics directive. There's been a lot of debate on the role of exports, and there's another regulation on packaging waste in the current final stages of negotiation within the community, within the European Union. So there's been quite a lot of results that are mostly in line with our recommendations from 2020. And beyond Europe, we've seen this very welcome global interests, which led in 2022 to a basic decision to set up a treaty, a new international treaty to address the the plastic pollution, particularly in the marine environment. And within that process, we have what we call a high ambition coalition, which currently has 64 countries, whose motives is to try and drive the current negotiating phase towards a challenging and ambitious treaty. So we decided to update all the messages that we had looked at in the 2020 report, bring them up to date with any new science, and also refocus it on the specific negotiations currently going on in the Plastics Treaty. Some of your countries will actually be members of the High Ambition Coalition already. If your country is not, then maybe after listening to this presentation, you'll consider whether it might be a good idea to join. So this is the contents of the current, much shorter note, and I will be going through the main issues in the next 10 minutes, after which we can have some more detailed discussions. So one of the central conclusions of the 2020 report was that we really have what we call a wicked problem. No one actually sets out to pollute the environment with plastics, but when the system and all the stakeholders operate, this is the inevitable outcome. So that suggests like a system failure or a market failure, and we pointed to the drivers of this continued systems failure. Manufacturers of the plastic resin, the oil companies, are all banking on 3 to 4% growth every year, so the size of the resource is increasing all the time. there's still no effective way of actually externalizing all those environmental and social costs of using plastics. And that makes, basically on economic terms, the actual original plastic resin far too cheap. So that leads to overuse. We didn't in those days see any significant signs, despite a lot of encouraging work by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others, to really start designing plastics and the additives with a view to effective recycling at the end. The key drivers were still on consumer acceptance, convenience, efficiency of use and such. We didn't see much other than greenwashing in some cases, or minor changes at the margins in the dependency of retailers on plastics. And we also had a continued trend in the design for easy life, hassle-free life by consumers, and consuming on the go, whether that's coffee, sandwiches, or whatever. So this is what we regard as a system failure. And that's coincided with what people don't often realize: it is quite difficult to recycle some plastics. And so we have technical and economic barriers to actually recycling them as well. So all this suggests a system failure, and we do suggest strongly to the Plastics Treaty that they try and address all the stages in these systems and try and reduce that failure rate, ultimately the leakage of plastics into the environment. The issue of really what are the real costs of plastics? As I mentioned, because they don't pay for the environmental damage at the time that they're made, they're too cheap from that point of view. In the last 3 or 4 years, there have been some additional economic estimates that come up to almost as high as $3 trillion a year in terms of the combination of social and environmental costs. These figures are always controversial, but it does give you an idea of the scale of the potential damage that is being ignored by the market. So our basis is that we should regard plastics use as part of, in the context of the circular economy. We still believe that, and that means we do need to think about reducing flows, reducing amounts, and we need to think about better use of the plastics once it's in the economy, and not just single use, just going through once time and being thrown away. We need to keep that valuable resource recycling, reusing in the economy much more effectively. That has implications right from the production side to the consumer disposal side, and is likely to be a major point of disagreement in the treaty negotiations. In fact, I understand it already is. One of the key alternatives that people have in their minds, including policymakers and consumers, is that it may be quite easy just to stop using plastics for some applications and switch to something else. In many cases, plastics have replaced other materials, whether that's metal or glass, in that, but weight factors make that rather difficult to reverse. So the first candidate for replacement is often paper. So we see paper, instead of plastic drinking containers, we see paper or paper plastic containers. One of the items which were prohibited or restricted in the single-use plastic directives was plastic cutlery. We now often see wooden cutlery. These are not resource-free. They just switch the demand from oil and gas as a feedstock to forests and trees as a feedstock. And so we are in danger of just shifting the environmental burden from one area to another. And in fact, some NGOs have already pointed to some of the negative implications on that, which we mentioned in our report. So we really do think the priority is to try and reduce particularly the vulnerable, unnecessary use, and try and reduce the actual demand and use of plastics in order to try and address the problem at the system level. And of course, that includes multiple reuse being encouraged as well. How do we actually try and feed those thinking into the actual supply chain of plastics? This has been established for some years, and the EU has done particular work on this in the last 4 or 5 years. This is applied in many other countries as well. It's the idea of extended producer responsibility. You really try and bring in the costs of that end-of-life disposal into the price system and charge levies, which are meant to reflect the actual costs along the whole life cycle. This is a good concept, but depending on how it's applied, it might be very ineffective or it might be very effective. What we want is to limit the use to that which is really important. And we also want to encourage manufacturers to think about the end-of-life costs when they're designing, so they can help use a plastic which is more easily recycled or ultimately reused. So this is a key tool which is already being deployed, but we give quite a lot of guidance on the detail of this. And again, this will be featuring in the Plastics Treaty. A key part of this, trying to reuse or recycle materials, are these deposit refund schemes, which you find in most, well, I think now most European countries. Some are lagging behind, yet to introduce it. The countries that have introduced it have very high recovery rates for things like bottles, PET bottles particularly, and and those can be recycled reasonably effectively. But even so, it would be more effective from the environment point of view if they could be reused. And again, that theme comes up again and again. Ultimately, it would be lovely to see consumers thinking of that container as not something that they bought and can dispose of as they like, but they should see it as something on loan that they have some financial obligation or ethical obligation to return. And that raises a lot of interesting questions, such as, with the logistics of return, are manufacturers going to collaborate to make that easier, or are they still going to want to compete? Consumer behaviour is often overlooked, but yet it is pretty fundamental to whether any regulation or any change is going to be effective. There are fashions of consumer concern. Certainly 5 years ago, consumers were very concerned about plastics. They happily took on the charge of using a plastic bag and started using their own bags. But such fashions are very short-lived and don't persist unless they are incorporated into the new system of choices and decision making. And basically, it's very simple. All these carefully constructed surveys of consumer behavior and research into psychology basically come down to the common sense that you need to present the consumer with the cheapest and easiest option, because that is the one they will take. They will not be driven more than 5 or 10% of the consumers just by environmental concerns. So it places a big challenge on retailers in order to make the ethical and environmentally responsible solution the cheapest and easiest. We can't rely on the majority of consumers who may not be particularly interested in that issue in deciding to do the right thing if it is more complicated or more expensive than the one you want to take. So consumer behavior is central to consideration of how we apply these regulations, as whether they're effective or not. The other key factor, underlying factor, is how do we recycle the end-of-life materials which we inevitably have. The one which is classically recognised, which we go into some detail in the report, is PET, the classic PET bottle with water or juice or whatever in it. These are recycled, but if you look at the figures, the mass flows, there's still a long way from anything like circularity. And other things, particularly single-use plastics, packaging which may be dirty and which has very different additives depending on its use, they present really large recycling challenges. And so we thought in order to have a holistic approach, we really need to have like a hierarchy of recycling. Ideally, recycle from what you're using to the same use, but then have a train. You can use that plastic to maybe lower quality grade, that's downcycling. But ultimately, there's still quite a lot which are difficult to recycle, and maybe you have to heat treat them to get something valuable, or ultimately get some energy from recovery. There are many technical areas where we could improve the simplicity of recycling. They're not always compatible with commercial objectives. So again, this is a case where we have to get people along different parts of the supply chain to work together. Certainly, you need to reduce the number and variety of additives. You need to only use additives which are consistent with recycling. You maybe need to simplify the polymers. We don't want polypropylene, polyethylene, PET and HDP all mixing up together. That makes it very difficult to separate. So again, you need to do some work to avoid that. Technology is quite promising. I mean, one of the most difficult things to recycling are these metallized films that are used in things like peanuts or crisps or sweets. They can actually be done with the same resin, which makes them more recyclable. But again, it requires people to design for recycling. And again, that should be a key theme that is in the treaty. A very controversial, but still a problematic issue is this export. Companies have been able to export large amounts of their difficult to recycle or impossible to recycle plastics to other countries in the claim that the other countries will recycle them. And we see lots of cases where these have caused local health and environmental problems, and they by no means can be seen as being recycled. So that was meant to be made more difficult under the Basel Convention modifications in 2019, but many countries are still exporting their difficult to recycle waste to non-OECD countries with big questions about what actually happens there, whether they're dumped or just burnt or just selectively picked and then disposed of in a difficult and unhealthy way. Commission is trying to control this and is recommending a ban on exports of packaging plastic waste. And again, this is maybe setting an example that the treaty should follow. So finally, we're talking about, the next key issue is, of course, what does it mean for us, particularly the issue of microplastics and nanoplastics. As all of you know, plastics may start off as large, but they only degrade physically. They don't biodegrade normally. They're structurally incapable of doing that with some exceptions. So we're seeing a gradually development of microplastics. We are now able to measure those almost everywhere. The most recent finding sampled the clouds at the top of Mount Fuji in Japan and found 8 different types of plastic just in the mist, suspended in the mist. They've been found in Arctic snow and the deep sea, just about everywhere now. So they are very pervasive in the global environment. That, of course, gets into marine life, marine food stocks, and gets into us. And we also absorb it ourselves through drinking water and also through inhalation in many cases. This is including microplastics from textiles and road traffic, as well as those that are broken down from the larger initial sources. We've managed to detect them in our bodies just about everywhere, but we still can't do a proper risk analysis because we don't know whether the effects are just going to be like physical or they're going to have some interaction with the immune system. So we are expecting quite a lot of additional data to come out in the next few years as research continues on this. We have the European precautionary principles, which says we should be concerned about this even before we start seeing people seriously adversely affected. And so how to develop that new scientific data is quite an important issue, which should be engaged in the treaty. We had a particular fashion 4 or 5 years ago into the bio word. We had bio bottles and bioplastics, which were marketed as something which was environmentally friendly. The situation hasn't really changed. The degree to which it's environmentally friendly depends very much on the feedstock and the process, and there's a big danger of just shifting the environmental burden from fossil fuels to competition with food, competition with biodiversity, depending on where you're growing the bio feedstock. In any case, once they are in a bottle, they are like any other plastic, and they should not be treated differently. Biodegradability has also only made slow progress since 5 years ago. There aren't any plastics which are sufficiently degradable fast enough to be happy about them being released into the environment. Many of the release pathways, many of the degradation pathways are not bio and are just, as I mentioned already, through breaking down into smaller parts. There are some resins which are chemically inherently more degradable, but their rate of degradability is still quite slow, and one needs to have some reasonably good test results in order to assess how quickly they will disappear from the real environment. So this is likely to be an issue which the treaty needs to specify in terms of standards, how to apply it, and how to make sure we don't get too much greenwashing by just labelling a material which doesn't have any real effective improvement on the environment. So just to sum it up, what are the key messages and the key challenges? Because these are really big challenges. The big one that comes from ours and many other reports is that we need to break out of this perpetual growth model. We need to think about how to change attitude changes so we don't have this one-way thinking, this just use once and throw away attitude. We need to think very hard about how we can get better reuse of the plastics that's in the system, and that itself may lead to a fundamental shift in industry and consumer behaviour. Finally, we need to take a message from other international treaties. There are a lot of international treaties on environmental issues because humanity's economic activities and resource production have caused many environmental issues and still do. Not all of those treaties have been successful. I mean, we see the Climate Change Convention meet now every year, and the situation tends to have got worse in between each meeting rather than better. The best one I can think of is the Montreal Protocol, which did successfully control the chemicals responsible for depleting the ozone layer, and that ozone layer is actually recovering. So we do need to look at those as well and try and make sure the Plastics Treaty can be seen in 5 or 10 years' time as successful as the Montreal Protocol and not just a continual annual discussion about the way the problem is getting worse. So that's our main work. I'll just mention that what we've concluded is fully consistent with the objectives of the High Ambition Coalition, which I already mentioned, as having 64 countries supporting it. They agree that we should restrain plastic consumption. They agree that there is a need to go to a more circular economy, and they agree on the need for a better recycling system. So we are fully supportive of that, and we hope that our contributions has helped in that way. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and hope you found the talk useful. Thank you.